Что касается расширения НАТО в целом,
As for NATO expansion in general, you know our position on this issue, it remains unchanged.
не меняется. Украина суверенное государство и сама
Ukraine is a sovereign state and has the right to choose its own path to ensure its security. I do not see anything special here or anything that could overshadow the relations between Russia and Ukraine.
могло бы омрачать отношения между Россией и Украиной.
That was Putin in 2002, before he became the new Russian Tsar, before he changed the Russian constitution to make sure he has power for life. But now that he has absolute power, he doesn't want peace. He wants a piece of Ukraine. And that's why he doesn't consider Ukraine a sovereign state anymore. And somehow he considers NATO a threat. Just take a listen to what he said 2 days ago on December 17th.
We do not request or demand anything from anyone. All we do is we insist is on keeping the promises we were given. It was said in public that NATO would not expand to the east. But what do we have? They just ignored this. There was one expansion wave after another. It's not that we ask for something special. All we want is the promises that we were given are respected.
Now Putin says that NATO promised the USSR that it would not expand. But unfortunately, the Soviet leader who was actually part of this negotiation with NATO leaders says that there was no such promise. In fact, he goes on to say that they didn't even talk about this. Because NATO doesn't expand. Countries come into NATO on their own by applying. NATO is not going around asking countries to join. Just take a listen to this message yourself from Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader. This debunks all of Putin's lies.
Today, one asks me why it was not contractually fixed that the NATO must not expand in the East. At that time, there was the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But how should we fix it? The question didn't get raised at that time.
Das heißt,
Is it a myth that the West deceived you with respect to the NATO East expansion?
ja, das ist tatsächlich.
Yeah, that's actually a myth. There the press, the dear press, has her hand in the game. Up until today, there are false theories that Moscow had promises during the German reunification process, before and at the conclusion of the 2+4 treaty, that the Western Defense Alliance would not expand eastward. We insisted that Germany does not belong to a defense alliance, so neutral place. But it ended with us at the American-Soviet summit in Camp David. We gave our approval for a united Germany in NATO. On the one hand, is the full state sovereignty. Then it was also clear that it decided itself about which alliance they would belong. In Moscow, we also have the Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Jasov asked if the NATO East expansion 1989-1990 was a subject in the Kremlin. Gorbachev never discussed with me about guarantees of the West. I don't know if he had any agreements with the USA this question, but I think there has never been such conversations.
Nie gegeben hat.
Not one, but there were two different high-ranking Soviet officials who both say the same thing. There was no such negotiations. But Putin goes on to repeat this lie over and over again. And it's not just Putin. Lavrov does the same thing. Peskov does the same thing. And every single Russian supporter who supports the Russian invasion says the same thing. But in reality, that claim is not supported by any facts. And on top of all this, this is not the only lie that Russia uses. Russia has a Rolodex of lies that they use to justify their invasion and justify their killings of innocent Ukrainian citizens and Ukrainian kids. That's why recently I asked Professor Branislav Slanches, who's been following Russia for decades, to debunk all the lies that Putin has been pushing. This is by far one of the most important conversations I have ever had, and I'm certain that you guys will enjoy it and you guys will learn from it. But before I show you the conversation, I just have one simple request. please be sure to share this video and please be sure to hit the subscribe button down below because it tells YouTube to show this video to more and more people. And I truly believe more people need to see this because people keep falling for the Russian lies when they're so easily debunkable. Russian lies are just not supported by facts. So here's that conversation. Welcome back, everyone. Today we have Professor Branislav Stranchez, and he's a professor of political science at University of California, San Diego. I'm excited to talk to you. Welcome to the channel.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we can jump right into it. This is how I actually found you. It was a very good write-up, and it showed like how clearly you're thinking about all this. And I don't know if you saw this. Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, just this morning tweeted that NATO keeps expanding. And that's the excuse Russia has been using all this time. So maybe you can give us your overview of how you counter that argument that Russians have been making all this time. NATO expands, that's why Russia feels like they have to invade other countries for some reason.
Yes. So the argument, like many things that the Russians say, there's always some facts, underlying facts that they base their statements on to make them stick. And then they extrapolate from these to reach conclusions that they want to convey, right? And so here the basic fact is that Russia doesn't like NATO getting new members, especially the ones that are close to its borders. That is true. They have never liked this, but the reason is not the one that they currently say, and a lot of their supporters claim to be, which is security concerns. So essentially, the common argument with the NATO expansion, how they call it, is that supposedly the West promised the Soviet Union at the Cold War was kind of winding down, that it would never expand eastwards. We can discuss this if you want to. I'll be happy to give you the details. That's just not true. It's specific. It has to do with the specific case of East Germany. It's a promise that we did make in writing, and we've kept so far. It did not include any. It did not involve any prejudice about including new members from Eastern Europe. Now, the argument that the Russians are making is that this, including these members that are closer to the Russian borders, is somehow threatening their security. And usually this is based on the idea that, look, the Nazis came through Poland, the Germans in World War I came through Poland, and so anything that comes close to our borders threatens our security, right? So this is the basic argument. And so the idea there is that we kind of, the West provoked the Russians by constantly getting these new members, and finally the Russians couldn't take it anymore and attacked Ukraine because supposedly Ukraine was about to become a member. Aside from the facts that, yes, the Nazis and the Germans before went through Poland, and Napoleon before this went through Poland to attack Russia, and none of this is true anymore. So basically, here's how I counter this. First of all, with respect to the threat, the problem with the Russians have is that they really cannot offer a whole lot to their neighbors. Aside from cheap energy and access to raw materials, they're just not an attractive commercial partner in general because they're not super rich. They do not innovate very well at all, actually. The entire economy of Russia is the size of Italy, and so they're not really an attractive economic partner. And so what this means is that all their neighbors, usually, especially the ones in Europe, left to their own devices, just through economic interests, they drift westwards. They try to establish relations with the West. And that's happened with the, not just with the Russians, with the Soviets before them and the Russian Empire before this. And so the problem now for the Russians is that means that they will lose influence in these places. They will lose their, economic influence and political influence. And so they usually try to meddle in the politics in what they call a near abroad in order to keep these interests going. They do this by establishing, these relations that depend on cheap energy, of which they have in abundance, for instance, in raw materials. They promote interests that promote these links, and then they finance, meddling in politics. And so what usually then happens is that when this meddling doesn't work, they revert to threats. And because all of these countries around them are much, much weaker one-on-one with respect to Russia, all of them are worried that when this coercion comes, they will not be able to withstand it. And so they will have to succumb to these threats. And so their only chance is essentially finding an external force that can help them, an external alliance. That would be NATO. And so what people call the NATO expansion is not driven by the West, by the US or anything like this. This was driven by Russia's neighbor desperately trying to find a way to protect themselves from the Russians, right? In fact, there was quite a bit of opposition initially, even when the Eastern European countries wanted to become parts of NATO, because, well, why should we do this? Like, what exactly are we gaining? Like, we understand why they want to go in. The question is why we should let them in, was always kind of the issue here. And there was quite a bit of debate in the 90s whether we should do this. And essentially the idea was we came down on the side like, this is the way to prevent possible Russian revanchism, basically an attempt to undo the verdict of the Cold War, is by preventing the encroachment on Europe by getting these places into NATO, and hopefully this will deter the Russians. They will not try to do their usual things. And even in this, we were very careful to only admit, essentially, no members from the former Soviet Union. The only 3 countries that were admitted into NATO are the Baltics, which were republics in the Soviet Union, but they're a very special case. You see, the West never recognized them as parts of the Soviet Union. Throughout the entire Cold War, they maintained embassies in Washington. They were basically independent. We did not recognize Stalin's annexations at the end of, in 1940 that he did. And so, from our perspective, they were just like Poland and Czechia and Bulgaria and these other places, which were in the Soviet sphere, but they were actually independent countries. This was very different from Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and these places, which were recognized as republics, right? And so for those, we treated them very gingerly because, again, contrary to this idea that NATO is provoking Russia, the West always had a very specific policy to appease the Russians. Essentially, as long as the Russians, did what they did and did not come very, further west, we kind of were not happy is probably the wrong word. We were okay closing our eyes. And so every time the Russians would do something, like when they fought in Chechnya, when they invaded Georgia, when they created problems in Moldova, the response was always to condemn it at first, and then within a year, reset the relations, try to figure out to accommodate them, and not push it really any further. And this has been the pattern, irrespective of who was president. This is Democrat, Republican presidents, has always been the case here, and has always been the case with the Europeans, especially Germany under Schroeder and then Merkel, right? And so the idea there was, we're going to have these Eastern Europeans in NATO, this will deter the Russians. Of course, the Russians hated this because that meant precisely that they could not exercise their influence in these countries because they would not be afraid of coercion. And naturally, these countries would drift toward the European democracies and the European economic system. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. So the Russians were unhappy about NATO, but not because of security. Now, how do we know that it's not because of security? That's a good question, right? Because people always assert it. I just gave you another story. We know this from several sources, in particular Russian sources. First of all, the Russians, when they tried to reform their military in the 2010s, for example, the way they reformatted the military is essentially they organized this as a rapid deployment force that's very useful to be used in the near abroad, very close. They were not meant to fight a NATO-style war, like a massive war. Unlike the Soviet army. The Soviet army was built and organized to fight NATO. The Russian army never was. And the reason for this is because they understand that NATO is actually not a threat. After the end of the Cold War, NATO is a potential adversary, sure, but not an actual threat that can invade Russia and do something to Russia. For this, they have nuclear weapons. They rely on deterring NATO, basically, from invading Russia. They rely on their nuclear weapons to do this. And we know this from a very interesting source, actually. So, first of all, you have the observable behavior, how they reformatted the armed forces. So you cannot be saying you're afraid of NATO and then not prepared to resist NATO invasion or prepare for a war with NATO. They didn't do any of this. Under Serdyukov, the reforms, there were nothing of the force they built had nothing to do with the force that the Soviet Union had. But more directly, we actually have a very interesting statement. There's the Assembly of All Russia Assembly of Retired Military Officers. It's a huge organization, and its chair was General Ivashov. And so this guy, who's, by the way, he's a greater Russia imperialist. He wants Ukraine to be part of Russia, right? He's not some kind of bleeding heart liberal or anything like this. So he was the chair, and on the eve of the invasion in 2022, the organization published an open letter on the organization's official website, an open letter against starting the invasion. Basically, just a few weeks before the invasion began, this was addressed to everybody, and it attacked, in this letter, they attacked the supposed motives for the war, in which they said, and so again, these are the military retired officers in their own name, on behalf of the organization. Now, I saved it at the time and I translated all of it into English, but now it's gone. Now you have to use the Wayback Machine to find the letter because they removed it from the website eventually.
Are these people Were they in Russia when they did this?
They're still in Russia. The guy's still alive. Yeah. You can find the interviews with him on YouTube, and then he'll explain all about the imperial dream and how, But basically, the idea there, that's exactly what he said. He said, NATO, that's a red herring. NATO is not a threat. NATO has not been preparing anything that we have detected for any hostile action, which is actually true. I'll give you a little bit of data about this, which is very interesting too.
100%.
Okay, I'll do it right now.
Yeah.
So here's the data that supports it. Before 2014, so the last year of peace, so to speak, before the Crimean annexation, if you look at the amount of spending by NATO countries, especially the Europeans, on the military, they were on average at about 1.5% of GDP, which was below the 2% target. And the spending was, I did a little correlation to see whether it correlates with the distance from Moscow. Basically, how afraid are you of the Russians? How worried are you from the, about the Russia? No, it didn't. It's totally flat. The spending had zero correlation, none. The regression line was totally flat if you plot distance versus military spending, nothing. But now,
Wait,
NATO,
quickly. I think this is on your website, right? All the
yes.
Okay, we'll show it. This is just for editor. Make sure to show the charts on the screen. Yes, you can find it on both charts that I'm referencing are there. And so the idea there is simply that the Europeans were free riding on the security umbrella provided by the United States. They had essentially more or less disarmed. Yeah. And that is why they were doing business with Russia. They were building Nord Stream right after the Russians invaded, Georgia. The Germans go with Nord Stream 1, then they go with Nord Stream 2. No problems, right? They keep building these things and resetting relationship. And nobody's arming to do anything. I mean, NATO is a defensive alliance. Who's going to be going to invade Russia for what purpose, right? That's always the question that nobody seems to be able to answer, because anything we wanted from Russia, which is just the raw materials and the energy, the cheap energy, they were just selling us anyway. What would anybody want to go and do there and conquer anything? And so now, however, if you look at the spending, now the average is over 2%. It's, I think, 2.5, if I believe. And there is a definite gradient now. Basically, the closer you are to Russia, the more you're spending now on the military. In fact, in this simple estimate that they did, every 1,000 kilometers that you get closer to Russia increases your military spending by 0.5% of GDP. So wow, that's huge.
It's significant. It's very significant. And that's a clear reaction to the threat that they posed. And so when people say NATO provoked Russia, they have the causality exactly backward. The Europeans were in fact happy to just pretend Russia is okay, a normal partner, and not doing anything. And only after the Russians started behaving aggressively did they start changing their allocations. And so now you very clearly have a buildup, and it has to do with essentially deterring a further encroachments by the Russians toward Europe. And then also this has to do with the supposed promise that we made the Russians not to expand NATO, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. The idea there is that when the Soviet Union...
we could go to there, but I wanted to bring you back to the letter from the former Russian military.
Oh, yes, I forgot.
I'm so sorry.
There. Yeah. Yes. So he lists this. He basically says we have this idea that somehow NATO is this threat, but NATO is not a threat. It's an adversary. We can totally deter them with our nuclear weapons. This is an internally manufactured crisis, is what they call it. This is basically, we have failed to win the hearts and the minds of the Ukrainians with our model of governance, because our model of governance has failed. We have demographic, economic crises, all sorts of problems. Nobody wants to be with us. And we're doing what essentially we have done in the past, which is we're now trying to force others to be with us. And he said, that's not going to work. You cannot force people to like you. We have not provided an attractive alternative, and now we're going to try to coerce them. And this is going to backfire, because they will come to hate us, essentially, and then we will lose this for in the long term. Is going to be a disaster. It's a very perceptive letter. I mean, he essentially lays out exactly the dynamic that transpired after this invasion began. Yeah. And he warns, don't do this. This is going to be very bad. And so I have the translations also, I think on my blog, I've provided some. I'll give you the link to the Wayback Machine if you're interested in to post this letter. It is very incisive. Basically, he just does the great analysis of this. And again, it's posted in his own name on behalf of this retired military officer association. So it's a big deal. So we have it from them. And again, so if you put the reality of how the expansion, the enlargement of NATO happened, against this backdrop, it's very clear that the story that NATO is threatening somehow Russia has absolutely no basis in reality. You know, they say, oh, you know, we surrounded Russia with NATO bases and there's NATO troops everywhere. Well, in 2014, sure, we had bases. We have quite a few bases around the world, obviously, especially the U.S., not just NATO, but the U.S. specifically. But the U.S. had managed to station a little over 300 troops in countries bordering Russia. These are mostly embassy personnel and things like this. The vast bulk of the deployments were where they had been for half a century in Germany, Italy, in the UK, for Europe, and then we have some in the Middle East, obviously, because of the war on terror, the global war on terror, and we have in the far, in the Indo-Pacific, obviously this would be Japan, South Korea, right? And so we haven't changed any deployments. And that is, he actually mentioned this, Ivashov himself, it's like NATO hasn't made any moves. They haven't deployed any new troops. They haven't built any new capabilities. Where is the threat coming from? What are we exactly responding to, right? And so the problem is that some of these arguments that people bring up, like, oh, the Russians are worried, they come from a theory, essentially, in international relations. This is the people like John Mearsheimer and people like him, they like to bring this up, is that according to the theory, everybody's always worried about their own survival, and so you're always worried of what others might do. And so the theory says you should worry, and so they assume everybody worries about this. But that's an empirical question. It's like, the question there is not whether in some theory you should be worried. The question is, were the Russians worried for their security? And the answer was no. They were worried, definitely worried about loss of influence. And they were especially worried about loss of influence in Ukraine, right? And we can talk about specifically Ukraine because it's a very special case for the Russians. That is why we treated Ukraine very gingerly. But before we go to Ukraine specifically, let me just say about the promise that we made.
James Baker.
Again, very, very common kind of misperception. So the Cold War is kind of winding down. You have the Soviet Union, cracking at the seams at this point. Gorbachev is trying to figure out what to do. And so 1989 is becoming increasingly clear that Germany is going to become unified. There's basically the hurtling toward unification, and the Soviet Union really doesn't want it, and the Americans don't want it either. And so the U.S. and the Soviets, we meet and they talk like, what are we going to do? The Germans are going to unify. We can't stop it. And there's a big question now because from the Soviet perspective, when Eastern Germany becomes unified with Western Germany is part of NATO. And so now you're going to have an enlargement of the NATO state, and in particular, the eastern part now of Germany is going to be thrust in the middle of the Warsaw Pact, which still exists. And so from the Soviet perspective, it's like, well, this may potentially threaten Poland and Czechoslovakia and these places. We don't want this. And so the proposal is perhaps the Germans, the unified Germany, could leave NATO, right? And so it will become neutral, and then that would not be an issue. But here where the problem now comes is that, okay, suppose they leave NATO. Who's going to provide for their own security? Well, I guess they would have to provide for their security. They will have to start a buildup. I don't know. Maybe they will decide to build nuclear weapons now. And so now the worry is if the Germans leave NATO and start providing for their own security, they may become essentially, revert to the old type of thinking. It's like a strong Germany in the middle, relations with France, relations with its neighbors, like what's going on, people start worrying. Remember, NATO had 3 goals, is to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in for that purpose, and the Germans down. That was the 3rd goal for NATO. That's always been the case from its inception. This was a way to prevent Germany from rearming fully the way it could, given its potential. And so the Americans actually proposed this idea. How about we do this? We keep the united Germany in NATO, and so they will have no reason, we'll provide the security essentially, as before. They will have no reason to rearm or anything like this. But to alleviate the security concerns of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets, we will promise that no NATO troops will be stationed in East Germany, no nuclear installations will be put there, nothing like this. So basically, we're not going to militarize that part. Only German troops will be there. No foreign troops, anything like this. And then Gorbachev said, okay, let me go think about this. This is the famous not 1 inch eastward. We will not expand NATO jurisdiction that way. That was the idea. And so the Soviets went back, they talked among themselves, and they came back like, yeah, that actually sounds like a good plan. Let's put it down in writing, which we did. So we wrote the treaty specifically promising this, and we have fulfilled this promise to this day. So this is in effect, and it's working just as promised.
So there was a treaty, okay, because that's the one part I haven't heard. There's a treaty specifically about East Germany.
We have the agreement, with the Russians. This is very specific. We have promised this. No troops, no nukes is how I call the formula. And that's specifically for East Germany.
Okay.
Now,
I'll try to look for the treaty so we can show it on the screen.
Yes, yes. I can also give you the links. And so now people say, kind of extrapolate from this. They start saying, well, the Soviets understood this as an informal agreement that covers all of Eastern Europe. That is an absurd proposition. And I'll tell you why it's an absurd proposition. It requires you to believe that the entire diplomatic apparatus of the Soviet Union is staffed by complete idiots. They basically want you to believe that such an important agreement not to get any new members in Eastern Europe would be sort of an offhanded remark, a handshake, wink, wink, we wrote it on a napkin kind of stuff, instead of codifying it, specifically writing it down for everybody to see. In particular, and notice there's three arguments about this. First, the Soviets know that they're dealing with a democracy here. These different administrations, they come and go, different preferences. If you want to have a stable agreement, you better write it down. Because if you just have an informal understanding of some sort, there's no guarantee that the next president is not going to have a different understanding of the situation. You need something in writing. That's number one. Number two, the Soviets were very keen on putting everything in writing. The Soviets had the largest diplomatic corps in the world. They had representation everywhere. They were extremely competent. They were very good at putting everything down in writing in ways which will allow them to then interpret it creatively later to their advantage. They were very good at this. To think that these guys are operating like some kind of dilettantes and that they did not know what was going on is absurd. Like, it just doesn't work. And number three, Gorbachev himself said this. He was asked in an interview, he's like, we are not stupid. Of course we didn't discuss this. I mean, had they discussed it, we would have written it down. Yeah. We didn't discuss it. That's why we have never written it down. And so this is it. Now, every next expansion, admitting new members after, like, as I said, long debates during the Clinton administration here, happened with the implicit understanding that it's going to follow the same formula. No nukes, no troops. In this new enlargement, this was never explicitly promised because there was never a new agreement with the Russians specifically about this, but it was always understood that this is how it's going to work. And that is exactly how it worked. We did not station any troops. We did not put new installations in Eastern Europe in these new places until 2014. After Crimea, we started deploying troops. And after 2022, that's when we actually increased much more dramatically with some forward presence. And again, this has the causality backward. This is the result of this aggression, not its cause. Yeah. And so this whole putting this together, NATO provoked it with these expansionist policies. Or somehow the Russians are afraid of NATO. They kind of sound good on paper. They kind of sound, okay, I can write it on the board. That, yeah, here's the map. I can show them the map. They can go through here. But in reality, the evidence actually all points consistently to the story that I just told you. And so I think we should be very careful when we interpret facts, not to give them the spin the Russians and their supporters in the West like to do, but simply look at the behavior of the Russians, what they're actually doing, and not just what they're talking about. Talk is cheap. You need to look at the actions.
But yeah, the Gorbachev stuff is crazy because, this was it. This whole lie about NATO was started by Putin, right? Was it there in the first administration of Yeltsin? You might know this more than me.
The discussions about NATO potentially causing concerns for the Russians, ironically, started with the Americans.
Okay.
We were very worried how to deal with the Russians from the very beginning. Remember, when Ukraine and were discussing independence, our own president, Bush, went and gave a talk in Kiev to the Ukrainian Rada, to the parliament, and said, please don't do independence. That's the famous chicken Kiev speech. Independence, bad idea. Because again, from our perspective, we were very afraid that the Soviet Union might collapse in chaos. And because it's a nuclear-armed force, right? We didn't know what's going to happen with the nuclear weapons. And so the idea was we're going to help keep it together. So ironically, we spent 50 years in the Cold War trying to bring it down, and then feverishly tried to kind of help it stay together. But of course, we didn't have any influence on this in the sense that the Ukrainians wanted their independence, so did the Belarusians, and so did the Russians, actually, and so they broke it up. And so, but we did try to stop this, right? And so our policy has been like this, essentially stepping very gingerly. What would the Russians think? Yeah. What would the Russians do? It's nothing like the story that's portrayed like, oh, we immediately rushed in to try to take advantage of everything. It's just not true.
Yeah.
Again, 100%. Because we were very worried about what's going to happen with the nuclear weapons and these nations, will they be able to survive independently? And what does this mean for the security in the region? We were kind of happy with the Soviets keeping a lid on all sorts of potential ethnic tensions or,
Yeah.
all sorts of things. And so that's kind of the reality, right?
And another thing about NATO expansion, which like it follows every time they invade, like a lot of the grouping follows countries coming in. It's like 2008, 2014, 2022.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was talking to someone in Sweden and they did not want to join NATO at all. But like 2022, it was like, they're like, oh, we kind of have to join it because otherwise like so many bad stuff could happen.
Yes, that is exactly the logic. They get afraid. The moment the Russians start throwing their weight around, the neighbors get really worried. And so they seek some kind of protection, essentially. And so Sweden abandoned centuries of neutrality to join NATO. And Finland, the neutrality worked for them very well, except it didn't work for the Ukrainians in 2014. They were neutral and the Russians annexed Crimea, right? Only then did they abandon neutrality. And the similar processes happen in Georgia, of course, which was invaded itself, and in Central Asia. And over there, the dynamics interest because obviously they're not going to go for NATO, but they're going to establish closer relations with China in the hopes that Putin will not cross Beijing. And that seems to be the case so far.
Now, I have a lot of questions about current events, but now you said about Ukraine, and Ukraine is a complicated issue, right? Like I'm still learning the Soviet history, like reading up on it, and Crimea has been always like, even after the formation of Ukraine, Crimea has been something like Russians were unsure about, right? Am I correct on that? Or how do you see that situation?
Yeah. So Crimea itself is kind of interesting because obviously it was conquered from the Ottomans, right? Then the Russians, the Empress actually, she had actually foreigners build the city. There were no Russians or Ukrainians in the Crimea, specifically in Odessa, for a very long time. There were a bunch of foreigners that built it. And then by the kind of mid-19th century, a lot of the foreigners began to leave, especially after the Crimean War. Then the Jews started to leave because of pogroms, and then a lot of Russians and Ukrainians moved in. And so what happened then eventually is that when the Soviet Union was formed, Crimea was part of Russia, right? Not Ukraine, the republic. However, it was extremely backward. The Russians were not developing it. It's very, very poor. And so Khrushchev, after a visit there, was scandalized how horrible this was and basically realized that the only people that can develop it would be the Ukrainians because they're right next to it, right? And so they decided to essentially settle Ukraine with the responsibility of developing Crimea. The Ukrainians were not happy about this, actually, but hey, the Central Committee said so, and so, okay. And so they transferred it, right? And so the Ukrainians then started developing. It became the responsibility of the Communist Party of Ukraine, and so the Ukrainians started developing it, and they were quite successful, right? And so when the Soviet Union fell apart, this was now part of Ukraine, and so it became part of independent Ukraine. As such, it was guaranteed by the Russians themselves. They specifically promised to respect the borders. But immediately, the ink wasn't dry on the Belovezh Accords, which just have, the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1992, they were already undoing essentially the agreement. Very early on, the Duma, the Russian parliament, in the spring of 1992, they adopted the resolution essentially saying that Crimea was illegally ceded to Ukraine and it's actually Russian, right? Immediately. They immediately started talking about taking it back, possibly with force. I have some interesting clippings I'll be happy to share with you from the Russian press at the time. One in particular caused quite a stir because one of the members, I think his name was Baburin, if I'm not mistaken, the leader of one of the factions in the Russian Duma, told point blank the Ukrainian ambassador that either Ukraine is going to rejoin with Russia or there will be war. Literally said that. Literally. There was open letters from some of the other politicians calling for potentially using force because why are the Ukrainians having a military? What are they going to do with this? Are they going to be, defending themselves from us? Well, we don't like that. And so essentially a lot of Russians see Ukraine somehow as Russian. That's just it. It's been like this from the very beginning. It's nothing, it predates Putin. In fact, it got so bad at one point that Yeltsin had to publicly deny rumors that he had considered using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Yeltsin, paragon of democracy there, the democratic transition. And his denial was so funny. The way he denied it, he said, no, it's not true that we discussed using nuclear weapons against Ukraine because the military told me that we cannot use the nuclear weapons in this way. And you're like, well, that's an interesting way to not discuss it.
They did discuss it.
It's kind of funny, yes. And so when this scandal happened with the threat essentially that there's going to be war unless Ukraine remains joined with Russia, Yeltsin didn't even deny it. They kind of didn't express a strong opinion about it. And again, that's because a huge part of the Russian elite remained revanchist. They did not like the outcome of the Cold War. It deprived the Russians of this world status, essentially of a superpower, because Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And people keep forgetting that part.
It's a nuclear power, not a superpower.
Yes, it's a nuclear power, but it's not a superpower. And so the undercurrent was there, always has been. Putin, for example, he did not come up with this suddenly in 2014. Even when he was mayor of St. Petersburg, we have now from the German archives a conversation that he had with one of the German diplomats where he was saying it's impossible to explain to the Russian people the loss of Ukraine, in Crimea specifically, but in general, the loss of Ukraine. No Russian government will be able to do this. Essentially, this will have to change, right? They had to be very careful how to talk about it, because we also know from surveys in Russia that the Russian population, back when they still had free surveys, that the Russian population did not want to annex or take over Ukraine. The vast majority, 2/3 of the Russians, were supportive of the idea of having two independent states in a very close relationship with each other. That is the precise same number that the Ukrainians had. They also wanted close relations with Russia, but they wanted to be independent. They did not want to be part of Russia. And that was true throughout the entire period. There was, although sometimes some Ukrainian governments, will make noises about joining potentially NATO, there was absolutely no support for this prior to 2014 in Ukraine. The population didn't care about this. They didn't see the point. Again, there's millions of Ukrainians who have families in Russia. A lot of Ukrainians live in Russia, right? Now they could move freely back and forth. There was no reason from their perspective to make this worse or escalate it or create an issue. And as I said, the Russians, the population in general agreed with this. However, the elites were a different story. There was quite a bit of revanchism in the elites themselves. And so it was just a matter of time before this, came to the fore somehow. And the way this worked, I think, and the evidence supports it, is that the Kremlin, tried to do its usual approach, which is to bring Ukraine closer to itself through meddling in its politics. And so it would sponsor political parties there, establish, lots of money poured into Ukraine. There's the Ukrainian oligarchs, just as bad as the Russian oligarchs. And so what happened in the Ukrainian elites was split into two groups, roughly. The ones who made their living with energy, the heavy industry, and these were oriented toward Russia because that's where the money was, the market was there, their source of income, and the more progressive kind of modern, IT and these guys who are more oriented toward the West. And so what happened is the Ukrainian politics began to swing like a pendulum back and forth, depending on who prevailed in the elections, right? And so you had these cases where you have a government is going to be very pro-Western for a while, then things change, the next government is pro-Russian. And every government, when I say pro-Western and pro-Russian, basically every Ukrainian government throughout this period tried to sit on both chairs. They tried to be nice with the Russians and nice with the Europeans in order to get the benefit of both. Because that kind of, that makes sense, right? If you don't want to commit to one side specifically, that's how you would do it. But the problem was, by the early 2010s, the situation had become economically quite dire in Ukraine. There was so too much corruption. The reforms had stalled, essentially. It was just very bad. And so they needed a lot of an infusion of cash. They needed a lot of money very quickly. And at this point, they had negotiated this association agreement with the European Union, but they had not signed it. And so Yanukovych, who was the president at the time, had a choice. Sign this agreement or sign an agreement with the Russians for their Eurasian Customs Union, and Putin was dangling cash. Basically said, if you abandon the European thing and come and do this with us, we will give you the money you need. And this is what he decided to do. And they could no longer play. The European Union said, okay, we're not going to give you any extra money. You now have to make a decision finally. Are you going to sign this or not? And Putin said, well, I will give you money. Just do the other thing. And so Yanukovych decided to withdraw from the associate agreement. And this is what precipitated Maidan. This is when the people came out. They said, wait. We had agreed to do this, right? And so initially, again, the first phase of Maidan was mostly limited to Kiev. It was the young people there. And this is when the government made a mistake. In retrospect, it looks like the Yanukovych government, apparently on advice from the Russians, decided to use force to disperse them. And that's when they shot at people. And this is when the Ukrainians now in general got shocked by this. They were like, wait a minute, we are now going in a direction toward a system that the Russians have. That is not the system we want. It went from pro-European, let's ratify the agreement. It went like, we need to defend our political system. This is when Maidan actually spread into the other cities and became a very big mass movement. Is the miscalculation by the Yanukovych regime.
He lost a lot of like support too, right, in the coalition, like the parties.
Yeah, that
because
actually
of-
happens quite often.
Yeah.
The same thing happened in 1956 in Hungary. Initially, you have small protests, the students are there, the usual suspects, and when the government uses repression, then other people come out because now they're worried not so much about what these guys wanted, but how the government is actually behaving, and they don't want that. And so a similar thing happened here, and suddenly you have millions of people now protesting. And so at this point, the West sends delegations and start talking, okay, we need to somehow prevent this from blowing up. And they start talking to Yanukovych, and Yanukovych proposes, all right, we need to make a deal with the protesters. Here's a couple of names here, the Klitschko and,
Wait, just
Yats-
I know what's coming. So Yanukovych is president, just for the people, right? He's
yes,
the president.
Yanukovych is
Because
president.
he's gonna float some name for prime minister. You can explain the story
Yes.
better than me. Yeah.
Yatsenyuk, yes. So he does float that name. At this point, that's the context of the very infamous phone call between Victoria Nuland and Piat, where they discuss which of these guys that Yanukovych has proposed is going to be kind of easier to work with. What should we recommend, essentially? And at this call, she's very also upset about the European Union, because the problem is that the European Union is dragging its feet. It is not helping. And it turns out part of the reason for it not helping is because some of the people that had been sent from the European Union, members of the European Parliament, for example, turned out they were in the pay of the Russians. And they were, in fact, sabotaging all of this stuff. Because the Russians were telling Yanukovych, do not make a deal, stand firm, we'll back you up on this. But Yanukovych basically didn't have the desire, I guess, to keep repressing the Ukrainians. He just would not do it. Again, that's very similar to another case with the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah of Iran was encouraged to use repression and he just refused to do it. And so Yanukovych, I think, having seen what happened initially with these 100 people that got killed in Maidan, lost his appetite for this. And so he decided to go for the compromise, right? And so they negotiated this, but then he became fearful that it's just not going to end well for him. And so he fled. And at this point, there's no government in place. And so the transition is essentially Parliament meets and they take a vote in which Yanukovych's own party voted it basically, yes, he's fled, he's no longer there, we need somebody else. So they voted against him, essentially, his own party, because they needed to form a government. And so they formed a government, which immediately set the time for a new election so they can redo this, right, and get a new government in place. And this is when the Russians activated their Crimea plans, right? So they had prepared quite carefully for this, probably for years, actually. So they just already had prepositioned forces there. Of course, they had the bases, so they had the military there. They had infiltrated quite strongly the local power structures. In particular, a lot of the Ukrainian Navy defected to the Russians when this happened. And so you have chaos in Kiev, where the new government is trying to figure out how to organize elections and what to do. It would be very difficult to organize resistance. And so the agents of the Russians, they take over the parliament in Crimea and literally at gunpoint demand that they organize a referendum, which they do. Of course, the referendum is not free, produces this nonsensical result that everybody suddenly wants to join Russia. Why is it nonsense? Oh, because we have the actual result from a similar question just from a few months prior. They had run these surveys throughout Ukraine in which they asked Ukrainians, do you support becoming part of Russia? They would literally ask these things. And we know from 2013, the last survey that they did this, which includes Crimea, the largest number there was, I believe it was about 41% of Crimeans had said, yes, we want to be part of Russia. Not a majority. And that was by far the largest percentage in the entire Ukraine. In Luhansk, it was about, I believe 30% or something like this. In Donetsk, it was 25, and then it fell off dramatically into single digits the further center and west you went. And again, I have the data for this as well. And so we know for a fact that when freely asked, and people could freely express their choice, 41% in Crimea said, yes, we want to join Russia. And suddenly they produced, I don't remember the number, 90-something% couldn't wait to become members of the Russian Federation. It's total nonsense, obviously. That's why nobody recognizes this referendum.
Also, I don't know if I remember this correctly, but I think only two options they had was become independent or join Russia. They didn't have the option of just stay with
that's
Ukraine.
Another interesting thing. All referenda, so-called referenda that the Russians run, always have the question, do you want to become independent? They always do this. But there's a reason for this. Under the Russian constitution, they cannot annex territories that belong to somebody else. So they have to legally first recognize the independence of these territories and then annex them. They did the exact same thing with Donetsk and Luhansk. Remember, the first thing they did right on the eve of the war is recognize their independence magically. So then they can annex them. They did the same with the so-called referenda in Kherson, in Zaporizhia, where they also asked about this. So that's just a legal quirk of the Russian constitution that you actually have to first be independent so they can annex you. So this idea, and this some people like Mearsheimer, for instance, always also like to point out, oh, they never intended to annex them. See, they recognize the independence. It's total nonsense. That's just a necessary step to the annexation, right? And they did the exact same thing with Crimea. And so in there, the prime minister later said the biggest mistake of his life was to listen to the Europeans, because Merkel told him, do not try to use force to deal with Crimea. We, the Europeans, will help you deal with this problem. And again, whether the Ukrainians had the capacity to deal with this, I don't know, militarily, given that they already had Russian presence there and it was quite strong, I don't know, but they never even tried. And so this is an interesting case that when this was happening, so when the annexation happened, I wrote a series of articles, you can find them on my academic website, about what's going to happen next. I sent it to Foreign Affairs, I sent it to many publications, and nobody wanted to touch them. So that's why they stayed on my website. And in this I said, look, nobody's going to help the Ukrainians recover Crimea by force. They themselves probably cannot do it either. So Crimea is basically gone. However, what's going to now happen next is the Russians are going to use the exact same tactic for southern and eastern Ukraine. So we need to worry about this. They're going to infiltrate it. They're going to destabilize it. They're going to use this essentially as a lever to get the new government, whenever it's formed in Kiev, to abide by the desires of the Kremlin. They will keep this as an open wound, essentially. So if you don't listen, we'll escalate the tensions. There's going to be fighting there. And if you behave, we will, take up proxies down a notch, right? They're going to do this until the Ukrainian government returns to the proper policy that is desired by the Kremlin. And so I said, so now here's the problem. They're going to use the usual pretext, which is to defend Russian speakers, Russian ethnic. They always use the same thing. They always protect somebody. Yeah. They always protect somebody. They used to protect the Christians in the Ottoman Empire the same way by invading constantly and trying to start wars there too.
Yeah,
so
this is interesting. Like there are a lot of parallels between Putin and Peter the Great, and he looks up to Peter the Great. I feel like that's probably some other podcast. That history will be.
Yeah, that's another podcast because the parallel is interesting because from Peter the Great is known as the person who returned to Russia the territories he had lost. The great reassembler. And so Putin, yes, absolutely sees himself
we'll have a future podcast. So everyone be sure to subscribe.
Yeah. And so the idea there is that the Russians are going to pursue this kind of policy. And I wrote at the time, like you can find it on my website. It's dated, I think, March, before the stuff had happened even in Eastern Ukraine. And I said, all right, so if they're going to do this, I think the Ukrainians are very likely to resist rather than to capitulate to the Russians. That was my guess. And again, part of it is based on, I lived in Ukraine for 4 years. I lived in Kiev back when it was still part of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And I do remember, what people would say when you went outside of Kiev and kind of went westward. I was starting just school, like elementary school. And so to me, yes, I didn't understand. So at the time, it looked like ridiculous stuff to me, kind of how, look at these backward Ukrainians, don't understand the civilizing Russians, because that's the attitude you learn. Only later do you start to, oh, wait a minute, this is what they actually meant by this. But I do remember some of the attitudes that they had. And I also spent some time in Mariupol. Back then, it was called Zhdanov. It was a closed city. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of remember some of these attitudes. And then what my parents had told me about because most of our friends were Ukrainians, about what they had talked and what their attitude was. And I thought, okay, I think the Ukrainians would resist it. And if that's the case, what's going to happen? They probably will not have the ability to resist on their own. And so eventually they will provoke, the resistance will provoke, the Russians will see that their strategy is not working, and the Russians will come in by force. And then Ukraine will be there fighting the Russians alone. And I said, all right, we have the right thing to do. I thought from our perspective, if you care about potential democracy and Ukraine not falling under Russian rule and helping the Ukrainians in their quest for self-determination, the right thing to do was to station Western troops in Eastern Ukraine, because these are the only troops that the Russians may have qualms about shooting at. May being the operative word, I'm not sure they would, so it's very risky. And I said, nobody's going to do this. That's insane. There's nobody in the West who's willing to do this. The Ukrainians will never request it. They themselves don't want to do this. And so that's off the table immediately. Then I said, since the right thing to do is not there, we have to do the honorable thing, which is to tell the Ukrainians, you guys are on your own. So you better make a deal with the Russians most likely, right? And I said, we're not going to do the honorable thing either. What we're going to do is what we always do. We're going to say that we support you, and we will do all sorts of grand pronouncements. And when push came to shove, we'll abandon them. Just like we abandoned the Kurds more recently. We've abandoned the East Germans, we abandoned the Czechs, we abandoned the Hungarians, we abandoned a lot of people this way. That's the way we often conduct business. And so I said, that's it. That's probably what's going to happen, is because they're going to believe that they won't be on their own, the Ukrainians are more likely to resist. And this eventually will provoke, essentially, the Russian plan will fail and the Russians will invade in force and you're going to have a war. I said the first thing that will happen, however, there's going to be this no man's land, essentially a gray zone in eastern Ukraine where the Russians are not going to claim it, but the Ukrainians will not be able to control it. Exactly as these things that they do with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So it's the exact same playbook, or Transnistria and Moldova, right? And so that's exactly what happened. The Russians tried to implement their playbook. They had people like Girkin and these guys infiltrate, essentially. They were financed by the Russians. They were given weapons. They were trained by the Russians. They recruited a lot of local hoodlums. And they went to Odessa. They went to Kharkiv. They went to Donetsk. They went to Luhansk. And they tried to take over, essentially, the central administration and get the local security apparatus, some of them, to help them. They were chased out of Odessa with some loss of life, as people know about this case. It's the most famous one. But they were also chased out of Kharkiv. But they did take a foothold in Kramatorsk, Slovyansk in particular, in Donetsk. And this is when the Ukrainians launched their what they call the anti-terrorist operation, right? And so they started using force to eject these guys. And because these guys at this point were a bunch of hoodlums just armed by the Russians, they started losing ground very quickly. And at this point, the Russians intervened. They intervened with real troops. They removed the insignia and everything, but we know exactly which units came from which parts of the Russian army. They came with the heavy tanks, with the heavy artillery, and this is when they inflicted the two defeats on the Ukrainians. Debaltseve is the famous one that led to the Minsk Agreements 1 and 2, right? And in the Minsk Agreements, Ilovaisk and Debaltseve, these are the two crucial battles that the Ukrainians lost. And so they decided, all right, let's freeze this as is right now. We cannot eject these guys now that the Russians are helping them. And so let's have a ceasefire. And so they agreed to this. The agreement basically is that there should be enough security in these areas that they can run free elections. The elections will be run under Ukrainian law, and then they will determine the status of these territories. It's going to be supervised by the OSCE, and so to make sure that they're legitimate. Immediately, of course, the so-called separatists, which again, they're not really separatists. These are Russians.
Oh, yeah, that's such an interesting thing I read, where Russia was like a third party in Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. It wasn't like, oh, we're supporting one side, we're fighting for one side.
Yeah, they always denied it.
People forget that, yeah.
Yeah. They forget it. They also now don't want to remember that once the Russians invaded, they suddenly, and yes, we did do this thing, and now we're going to have medals about it, and we're going to give people benefits for doing that. So they retroactively owned all of this behavior that we knew. We knew exactly where these guys had come from. And so they were maintaining this fiction, right, that they're only a party interested in peace at these negotiations. But the fact is, their proteges, let's put it like this, they sabotaged the elections immediately. They would not allow the monitors to go in. They would essentially threaten them. OSCE published numerous reports saying we cannot monitor anything. Eventually, these guys started running their own elections, not under Ukrainian law, basically just to ensure that none of this is going on. Because remember, the idea there is not to solve the problem, some problem with Russian minorities or anything like this. The idea is to keep this an open wound so you can exert pressure. You do not want this stabilized from the perspective of Moscow. You want to be able to increase the pressure whenever you need it. And so then the Ukrainians essentially, after a year and a, so about 14,000 people died there over 8 years, but the vast majority of these people died in the first year and a half. This is when the active fighting started. After this, the fighting largely died down. In the last 2 years before the overt invasion, there were no civilians dying. There were just a couple of civilians every year that died mostly by stepping on mines, essentially. It was what was going on. The rest were military personnel. And so what was happening is that the Ukrainians sealed the line of control and started developing this and just abandoned the other area to their own devices. The Russians did not invest anything in there. They started closing the mines. The area just went to hell, essentially, the economy. A lot of people left, most of them fled to Russia, actually. Another chunk went to Ukraine. The area depopulated and it stagnated completely. And so the strategy was failing. And so by the early 2021, it must have become clear to Putin that this is just not going to work anymore. He did give it one last shot in the usual way to influence the politics in Ukraine through the political parties. And so when Zelensky was elected, he came on a platform of fixing things with Russia. He's a Russian speaker. He's from this area, right? He's from Kryvyi Rih. And so he was there elected to kind of, let's solve this thing once and for all, right? And he tried. He went, he talked, and Putin just dismissed him. He just would not deal with him because he wanted concessions that Zelensky just could not give him, which was control of Ukraine. He wanted Ukraine to become like Belarus. Well, the Ukrainians didn't want this, especially after the loss of Crimea and then the 8 years of fighting. A lot of them had changed their opinion about how friendly the Russians really were. And so this would no longer fly. And so in order to basically, so Putin gave up on the thinking that Zelensky, clearly he tried to bully him initially. Zelensky would have none of this. And so it didn't work. And so he started financing another party, Putin did, right? Through Medvedchuk and these guys. And so they had their own TV station and things like this. And in the summer of 2021, the Ukrainian government essentially shut down the TV station because it was pumping Russian propaganda, anti-Ukrainian propaganda 24/7. And so they shut it down and started moves to basically get rid of this party. All right, which they saw as a conduit, Kremlin conduit. And at this point, they started confiscating some of the assets, Medvedchuk's assets. And I think this is when Putin finally had decided, okay, now we have to roll the dice. It's over. The attempt to put pressure through keeping Donbass, in a state of disarray, that failed. I could not get the Ukrainians to voluntarily do this. My other attempt to create a fifth column just failed miserably. That's it. The Ukrainians essentially seem to be turning toward the West more decisively. And so the only way to keep Ukraine in the Russian sphere of influence is outright invasion. And here they were planning on a blitzkrieg. That's very clear that they had planned on a very short victorious war. But again, the reason being is because contrary to what revisionist history now some people tell you, like Angela Merkel, who claims that she deliberately had Minsk, as a delay so the Ukrainians can prepare to withstand the Russians. We didn't do anything. After Crimea, we sent them blankets, for God's sakes. We gave them some Stinger missiles. The first Trump administration, did give them some javelins. Stingers, yes, the javelins, because we thought that if the Russians do something, it'd be like guerrilla warfare because nobody can withstand the Russian onslaught, right? The famous Kyiv in 3 days. Yeah. That was actually the assessment of the Western militaries. And so the Russians calculated it's going to be announced through Kyiv in maybe not 3 days, maybe a week.
I think they really wanted the Crimea 2.0, just go in, quickly take over like the government buildings and just, right?
There's two parts to this. One is they clearly wanted to have territorial annexations in eastern and southern Ukraine. So if you look at how they invaded, clearly they meant to occupy and control this territory. So this is what they call Novorossiya, the new Russia. What Putin has referred to repeatedly, he has said these are Russian territories, essentially. And so this includes everything, essentially, from Kharkiv, which is the largest Russian-speaking city in Ukraine, outside of Kyiv. That includes Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Odessa. So it's the entire Black Sea coast, the coast of the Sea of Azov, and the regions that border Russia. So this was slated for outright annexation from the get-go. This is how they invaded. It was very clear that they mean to occupy this area. They expected very little resistance there. Now, in order to make this stick, obviously, they also wanted to remove what they call the Kyiv regime, right? They wanted to replace the government, regime change in Kyiv. That is why they did the assault on Kyiv. The idea there being is either they're going to cause Zelensky to flee or will kill him or capture him, right? They will install a puppet regime that will then legalize separation of the territories that the Russians want and will be responsible for pacifying the rest of Ukraine. The model there is Chechnya. This is what they did with Chechnya when they installed Kadyrov, who used to be a freedom fighter, killing Russians in his youth, and now, he's the biggest henchman that they have there, running it as a satrapy, essentially, on Putin's behest. And so that's kind of the idea. We're going to make a government in Kyiv that is dependent on us. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of discontent, especially in Western Ukraine, about all of this. So that this government is going to be heavily dependent on our help, probably military, which we will provide. It's going to be exactly like Belarus. It's going to keep itself in power by some repression, and then we will subjugate Ukraine. We will dismember it and subjugate it. I think that it's very clear that this was the plan. And people kind of these days seem to forget that they actually came quite close to executing it, right? They had prepared very well. They had bribed the right number of people, infiltrated the right agencies. So in the south, their progress was very quick and unimpeded. The Ukrainians did not blow up the bridges that were supposed to prevent them crossing from Crimea into this part of Ukraine. They had maps of the minefields that they were able to get through. And so they had prepared their traitors quite well there, the collaborators from the Russian perspective. In the east, in Luhansk and Donetsk, the Ukrainian army fell back very quickly. They didn't have enough forces to deal with this. And in Kiev, they were extremely lucky that they spotted the helicopters. So they basically were coming with helicopters from Belarus. They got spotted, and essentially the bulk of the forces were not even there. They started taking shots at them and defending the airport, and so eventually the Russians took it, but they delayed it enough so the Russians couldn't provide the reinforcements with which to go into Kiev. And so that's when they sent the columns into Kiev, and that's when the Ukrainians were able to send in for reinforcements, and they managed to stop the Russians at the gates of Kiev by themselves. Ironically, roughly at the same lines where the Soviets had prepared the fortifications against the Nazis to fight the Nazis, they kind of had to reuse some of these places. And so to tell you, at this point when it started, I thought that my prediction will come true and we'll abandon them. And this is why I was wrong, because this is when everybody lucked out, the Ukrainians and the West, that Biden was president, because he decided immediately that he's not going to let Ukraine fall, and he organized the European response. The Europeans, I think, likely would not have responded like this had it not been for the United States leading, essentially providing the backstop to their response. We know this because when the Ukrainians approached the Germans, the Germans told them, let's just wait a few days, see how it develops and who we need to deal with, who's in Kiev, right? Everybody expected essentially that, Zelensky would run and the government would fall. And only the Ukrainians who they fought on their own for the first several weeks of this. Only when they managed to stop the Russians did the Europeans say, okay, maybe now there's a chance. Maybe we should now support them because the Ukrainians actually might be able to do this, right? And so people forget that the Russians came perilously close to fulfilling the blitzkrieg. It wasn't as badly organized as people kind of like to pretend in retrospect. I went to some of these places when the Ukrainians fought. You can still see how close they came to the downtown Kiev. Yes, it's crazy.
Now I know.
And so
go ahead.
No. And so the strategy that Putin had was predicated on a quick victory like this with a changing government. Part of the reason he was mistaken so the expectations played out in this part in the south, for example, exactly that they had planned it. But I think they had also underestimated how the Ukrainians would react. Interestingly, the FSB, we know they had run surveys in Ukraine prior to this, because of course they did, trying to figure out, they literally asked Ukrainians, how would you respond if the Russians invaded, right? And came to liberate Ukraine. Would you treat them as invaders or as liberators or kind of neutral? And it was not a majority of Ukrainians that said they would treat them as invaders. Even then, what the Russians really, they said they would not treat them as liberators either, by the way. So if you look at this, you're like, okay, no way should you expect them to be meeting you with flowers. Your own survey is telling you this. But the survey had another question. And that question was, will you pick up arms to defend Ukraine against the Russians, the invaders? And a lot of people said no. And I think this is what the Russians were basically banking on, is that, they may not meet us with flowers, but they're not going to fight us. And actually, incidentally, very similar surveys are run these days in Europe, and vast majorities of Europeans say they will not defend their country. And I always tell people, stop running these stupid surveys. You're answering a hypothetical in the safety of your own home. It's not like somebody's already in your country trying to take over your house and kill your children. You're going to think very differently if this happens. It's a very stupid hypothetical to ask people. And so, okay, but that's what they asked. And a lot of Ukrainians said no. But in these desperate first days, when the government essentially opened the warehouse and said, anybody who wants to have a weapon, we're going to issue a weapon, come and defend Kiev, defend your homeland. I saw the videos from various places, various villages and towns in Ukraine, where people showed up in the main squares, like, give us the weapons. And when they got armed, they turned the weapons on the Russians. They did not march on Kiev to take down their own government. And this is when I wrote another thing that I wrote very early on in March, is that as the Russians were barreling down on Kiev, I said, I think Kiev will not fall. The reason I think that the Ukrainians will eventually win this is because when the population got its hand on weapons, they went to fight the Russians, not to fight the government. And as a result, you cannot defeat an entire population. It's just not going to work. And so I said, we are now in for a very long war, because they will probably stop the Russians, but this is not going to be over then that easily. And I said, we're going into a Cold War II scenario where Europe will now have to separate from Russia. They will have to stop the Russian energy. They will start transitioning the crops. They will start limiting travel. Basically, a new Iron Curtain is going to descend. It's not exactly clear where in Europe it's going to descend. As a Bulgarian myself, I hope Bulgaria this time is going to be on the western side of that curtain. But I said, it's coming. It's inevitable. It's going to come, and we have to brace ourselves. I said, this war is going to define actually this century, because how we organize and respond to this is going to set the stage of how we deal with other threats. Like from the US perspective, China, for example. And so far, it seems that's exactly what's been happening since.
So the first one is, of course, about that 2014 call, because Russia is using that call a lot, and a lot of Russian pro accounts are using the call saying, oh, look, West was already planning a replacement for president. But in reality, that's not what the call was about. The president was part of the discussion as to who's going to be the prime minister. Can you explain that more clearly than I'm doing?
Yeah. Well, there's nothing more to explain. Yanukovych was trying to figure out how to basically get out of the mess he had created. And the U.S., but also the Western European, the EU diplomats, they were trying to figure out how to stop the violence and make sure it doesn't escalate. The entire purpose, thrust of U.S. policy there was to stop basically the violence through some kind of compromise and keep Yanukovych in power. And so Yanukovych proposed these names. And so then Nuland, they did what all diplomats do, which is to discuss from our perspective who would be easier to deal with. And so we will indicate to the two sides, like, who's going to be, for us acceptable in a sense. But again, this is their decision how to do it.
When you say there, you mean Ukrainian decision, right?
Yes, this is a Ukrainian decision. That happens all the time. This is literally what diplomats do, is try to figure out which people to interact with and how to do this. And then when they want to, the government wants to know, these kind of governments also, because they do want to have good relations with the Europeans as well and as the Americans, they're going to take into account which people to have more pro-Western views or even which people speak English or stuff like this. And so these are totally normal conversations. It has nothing to do with we are sponsoring a coup, we are paying protesters. It's nonsense that the people peddle. It's absolute insanity. And so that's the context. The problem is, of course, the Russians who intercepted the call and leaked it, they put it completely out of context and immediately gave it this spin. And that's how a lot of people have come to regard it as like, this is the proof that we're preparing the replacement. It is true that the American government has orchestrated a few coups in its history. Nobody would deny this. But that was not one of them. That's the point.
I just want to explain to the audience one more time. So protests were going on, and the Ukrainian president, wants to give in to some demands. So he mentions a couple of names for his prime minister. He's going to replace it, right? That's what's happening? He's going to replace. He gives these names to U.S. and U.S. is discussing in the call what name is more preferable for them. That's all that's happening. They're not deciding who's going to be the next president at all. But that's how Russians frame it.
They will communicate this to both sides, and then the two sides will still keep. They don't have to listen to the Americans.
Exactly. Now the next question might be the tougher one. So as you mentioned, in 1992, there was already talks in Russia about invading Ukraine or just invading Crimea, taking over Crimea. Why did Ukraine sign Budapest Memorandum then? From Ukraine's point of view, as much as you can explain, because that's probably a big explanation.
That's a big explanation.
By the way, quickly for the audience, the Budapest Memorandum was signed 2 years after this in 1994.
Yes. So the Budapest Memorandum is also misinterpreted. Usually the way it's portrayed is Ukraine had nuclear weapons and they decided to give it up in exchange for security guarantees of its territorial integrity. That's not what happened, unfortunately. What happened is Ukraine did not have nuclear weapons. Again, that's a misnomer. What happened is as the Soviet Union started to fall apart, the Soviet military got really worried about the nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands. And so there's two sets of the tactical nuclear weapons and the strategic nuclear weapons. The strategic are the big nukes, the ICBMs, the ones that go into strategic bombers, things like this. For these, they have security codes. And these codes are in Moscow. The Ukrainians don't have any access to them. Maybe after some time, they'll probably be able to break the codes and operate them. But they do not actually have operational control of these weapons. The tactical nuclear weapons are a totally different story. And there's several thousand of them in Ukraine. And so before even the independence starts, a year before this, the Soviet military starts transferring these nukes out of Ukraine and all other places, gathering them into Russia to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. And so by the time these discussions roll, there's no tactical nuclear weapons left in Ukraine. The only things left are the strategic weapons and some of the delivery platforms, the strategic bombers, for example, for which the Ukrainians have no operational capability. They do not have the codes or anything like this. And so what this means now is when Ukraine goes into these negotiations, it doesn't actually have nuclear weapons. It has the potential to maybe build one eventually, right? It does have the know-how, obviously. I mean, Ukraine was also the place where they were building the rockets and stuff. So sure, but they do not have nuclear weapons. Certainly they do not have control of anything, right? And again, and these are not the small ones. These are the big ones that, you fire the ICBM that goes into space and then goes down. You cannot fire it a few kilometers away. From our perspective, then, essentially, is we're trying to get them to give up the potential for having the nuclear weapons. And part of the problem there is, if they don't do this, they will become a potentially nuclear force that is not actually a nuclear force. There's a very dangerous situation to be in, because then the Russians will have a great incentive to try to go in to disable these by force, perhaps by striking first, right? This is called, in deterrence literature, this is called, you have a first strike advantage. First strike advantage means if I go first and attack you, I have a reasonable chance of disabling your entire nuclear arsenal, and so you will not be able to respond to me. And so when you have either non-operational nuclear capability like the Ukrainians, or you have very few nuclear weapons, you're very vulnerable to this kind of stuff when your adversary has a lot of them, like the Russians did. And so we know that is why during the Cold War, both sides developed what's called second strike capability, which is I can absorb an initial nuclear strike and I will have enough forces remain to return a retaliatory strike, which will be devastating. And so you have no incentive to go first. You're not going to help yourself. That's the mutually assured destruction idea. So here you're going to put Ukraine in a very bad situation in which it doesn't have the nukes, but it might get them. And so it's very dangerous how the Russians might treat this, right? They may, in fact, initiate the use force under the pretext that they're preventing Ukraine from going nuclear. And they will see a lot of sympathy for this in around the world. And so that's part of the thinking. And the Ukrainians, they understand this. They understand this, that they do not have anything. It's not like, if you attack us now, we can defend ourselves with nukes. And so the whole point is that when they negotiate this, they don't really have much to negotiate with. They're in a very vulnerable position. And so they're getting a crappy deal. That's it. The whole Budapest Memorandum was essentially a sham, and they knew it. Again, just as the Soviets were not stupid when they negotiated about NATO, the Ukrainians were not stupid when they negotiated Budapest. They had a very weak hand, and they got a very weak commitment. In fact, it was so weak, one of the key people who negotiated it, the previous president, when it was signed, his comment was, this doesn't give us anything. If the Russians, literally he said, if the Russians go tomorrow into Crimea, nobody will stop them. They knew it. They just couldn't do anything about this. And so the fact is, yes, the Russians, sold it. The Blair and Clinton, they of course sold it as this huge achievement and security guarantees. But that's a memorandum that nobody really guaranteed much of anything. And so we kind of have to remember this when we talk about this, why they agreed. The Ukrainians knew very well that they're facing these issues with the Russians. They knew it. That's why they tried to negotiate something, anything that could help. But they were in a weak position.
I'm sure there was the other part where, I think the Ukrainian economy was suffering worse than the Russian economy after the Soviet dissolution, 60% of GDP gone or something in the 90s.
Yeah.
So that probably played a role, right? Where they were like, we want to trade with the world. We want to trade with the world.
Yes, the idea was, we said, if you do this, we meaning the US, if you do this, we're going to give you a lot of money, to plow into your economy. Absolutely. That was kind of what the immediate gain was there, right? Perfect. And so eventually they did this.
Perfect. I think we'll end it there today because I have recent news thing. We'll do it again. And I found this, and I knew this would be a great podcast because the tweets you're writing, these are not like engagement based. These are like truly educational tweets. Even like 3 years into this invasion, more than 3 years, I'm learning stuff that I haven't heard about. So I'll link your Twitter down below, and definitely go check it out. Anything else I should link?
No, I mean, my blog post, my blog site is slunchev.org.
I'll link that too.
But
I think you're more active on Twitter.
Yeah, much more active on Twitter.